Welcome to Cultimatum, a podcast diving into the culture of cults and human trafficking. I am your host, Anonymous Andrew.
And I'm Melody, joining Andrew as his co-host. Having experienced the depths of a cult firsthand, specifically the House of Yahweh, I'm here as an advocate for fellow survivors. I run the Cult Escape and Recovery Support Group on Facebook. We are committed to respecting our guests' privacy and allowing them to use fake names or remain anonymous. And Andrew, before we dive in, a trigger warning: some episodes may explore explicit subjects such as sexual abuse, rape, human trafficking, suicide, and other potentially disturbing topics.
Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults and human trafficking. My name is Anonymous Andrew, and hi, Melody.
Hi, Andrew. Today we have a very interesting guest. Her name is Paulette Buchanan. She's an author of a book titled Fighting for Justice, Religious Fraud, Mental Illness, and the Collapse of Law and Order. Paulette has a really unique story and a really unique connection with a small online cult leader. And I'm not going to give away too much because I think you really need to hear it to believe it. Let's go right to it.
Yeah, let's get to it. You guys are going to love this one. All right, we'll talk on the other side.
Yes.
Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults and human trafficking. My name is Anonymous Andrew, and with me today is Melody. Hi, Melody.
Hi, Andrew. We have a guest today, Paulette Buchanan, who is an author of a book titled Fighting for Justice, Religious Fraud, Mental Illness, and the Collapse of Law and Order. Paulette has some experience in the cult life or the cult world, which is somewhat unique, but I'm going to let her explain that to the audience. Welcome to the show, Paulette.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Yes, welcome, Paulette. So tell us, how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, that's a question I'm asked often. And it was actually a civil rights attorney who years ago, when I explained what was going on with my brother, who runs an online cult and was engaging in aggressive harassment, defamation online, threats, including death threats, inciting his followers to also join in with him to harass us. I ended up talking to a civil rights attorney in Connecticut, in the western part of Connecticut, and she said, with my background, I have a degree in history, done a lot of research. She said, you need to write a book about this. You need to write about this and inform people not only about the problem with cults and how they can break the law with seemingly impunity, also the failures of the court system, basically law enforcement as a whole, to do anything to stop this. There were actual written laws that my brother has been violating all these years, over 20 years. And we really cannot get the laws enforced. And this is a common problem really with a lot of crime victims of any crime. But because it deals with cults, a lot of people say, oh, we don't want to touch that because that has to do with religious freedom. And I liken it to, I grew up in New England and the mafia was big in certain parts, like Providence and parts of Connecticut. And I liken it to the mafia setting up business fronts. That's what cult leaders do. They set up religious fronts. And so with that, they lure people in under the guise of being religious. I've been a big advocate for the licensing of pastors, that they, like any profession, should be required to go to an accredited institution and have that level of accountability. It's not perfect, and there's no profession that is perfect, but it would offer citizens a level of accountability. The military, at least they used to anyway, they had certain requirements and qualifications for anybody entering their chaplain program. And my feeling is if that's good enough for our military, it's good enough for the general public, for everybody's good, for a safeguard against these kinds of abuses. That nobody should be out there calling themselves a pastor or a guru or a reverend or bishop or any of these things without some kind of training, of accreditation, of accountability within a larger community in that profession. For example, the state of Tennessee has passed a law a couple of years ago that outlawed mail order ordinations and people getting them so as to officiate weddings. And so I view that as sort of a first step. And these mail order companies, one of them tried to sue the state of Tennessee, where we live, and they dropped the lawsuit because they realized they didn't have legal leg to stand on. It's not a matter of violating people's free speech rights or religious rights. It's a matter of accountability.
Wow. And Melody would back me up on this. So on my other podcast, I did a whole series on the Twin Flames universe, and I was just astounded about how law enforcement. So after Amazon and Netflix did their documentaries on the Twin Flames, you can see even in the documentary that the police come to the house to question them because there were some accusations of rape, forced labor. There was a suicide. And I'm going off memory here, but the police come in and they question Jeff and Shalia. And they, of course, gaslit them or denied everything. And then the police said, "Thank you for your time," and they walked out.
Exactly.
And I was like, really? Now, I don't have any knowledge as to whether the law enforcement in Michigan or the FBI are doing an investigation or building a case against them. You're shaking your head. No.
That really falls into what goes on with a lot of these cults, and they know it. With cult leaders, a lot of people think, well, they're just batty. Well, yeah. I mean, my personal opinion is every single cult leader out there seeking to manipulate and control people has some severe mental health problems.
Agreed.
I honestly, my own opinion, and I think this would be backed up with a certain degree of experts in the field of psychiatry and psychology, that many, if not most, if not all, cult leaders are psychopaths.
And narcissists.
And narcissists. They're very intelligent. They know how to measure up people, and they know how to read people, and they know how to seek out the vulnerable. They
Correct.
are predators. They really are predators. And unfortunately, our law enforcement is really inadequate to deal with that. And our courts really don't deal with it. I have long said our law schools need to start educating people in the field of cults, because many of them, as I mentioned before, they operate like the mob. They operate like, a terrorist group or a mafia type group. And they are breaking RICO laws, racketeering, everything else. And I think, again, they're using the guise of religion to do these horrific crimes against people. You mentioned about Alana McKenzie was the guest you had on, and I listened to that. And she's absolutely right. Cults not only encompass the religious realm, they encompass also political realm on right and left. And they also are involved in human trafficking. And you wouldn't think that would go together at all, but it does.
It does.
And unfortunately, our college campuses are big time target areas, hunting grounds for cultists of every sort. And it's because if you think about it, people going off to college for the first time, they graduate from high school, they're freshmen, they don't know anybody. And so they're trying to get their bearings. They're away from home. They're in a vulnerable state. And so college campuses are big time recruiting areas for cults. And I tell parents and grandparents, you make sure your child doesn't get sucked into this, because it will be life altering and it will be devastating, not just for the child, which really is not a child, but an adult, a young adult. But it'll also be devastating for the family. And so in the conferences that I've gone to and that I've spoken at International Cultic Studies Association, I've heard so many horror stories of people whose sons and daughters got involved with yoga. And the practice of it isn't that bad, the breathing techniques and, the exercise, but it's the mentality behind it. That is, in one sense, a lure. Self-improvement cults, really big, and especially on college campuses. where they lure you in. I heard a story from one of the conference attendees who talked about when she had a bad breakup and she was in the grocery store, and they have the magazines at checkout counter and all that stuff. And she was flipping through one and saw one about, how to make your life better or something to that effect. And this woman standing in back of her saw her reading this article and pounced on it. This woman in back of her was part of a self-improvement cult. And look, that's just it. They look. They're not just like proselytizing willy-nilly. They look for the vulnerable. And this woman had her radar up to look for anybody and everybody. And she just happened. It was a happenstance, situation. 10 minutes later, it could have made a world of difference. But this poor woman got involved in this cult because of the woman behind her. And it really took quite a bit of convincing by her friends and her significant other, and also her family, to say, you got to get out of this. This is a cult. And they do it incrementally. They never put the cards out on the table all together at first. They always do it incrementally. And it's something where, again, I go back to our law schools need to start recognizing this, as they need to do a whole course on the problem of cults. And actually, I wanted to recommend to your listeners, Marcy Hamilton is an attorney. I believe she's out in California. She wrote a book several years ago called God versus the Gavel. And it talks about the problem with these groups that are using religion as a as a ruse to go after communities, to go after individuals. Scientology is obviously the big name of a bad cult, that goes after communities. They set up community centers and things like that, and they kind of invade. They're also a really prime example of all these smaller type cult figures who abuse the court system to sue anybody, either former members, or sue anybody who outs them with documented evidence. As attorneys, we talk to about my brother because he's online, he's seeking public trust. They said he's made himself a limited purpose public figure. And in doing that, he has opened himself up to public scrutiny. And so they advised us, you need to put up a website warning the public about him, because first of all, you need to defend your own name and reputation, because he was calling me a domestic terrorist, accusing me of crimes against children. Here I am, an educator working with children. These were the kinds of things he was doing. He was hitting low and hard and fast and repeatedly on defamation. And again, he was able to succeed in getting people to believe his outrageous, but just scandalous lies. So
could you explain to the audience exactly why he was attacking you, Paulette?
People have asked that question for a long time. They say, this is your own brother. Why is he doing this? Some people have even said, what did you do to him to make him do this to you? It's like, I was born female. This has been an ongoing family sort of tragedy, really. I write about that in my book in the first opening part of it, because the lawyers asked that, friends have asked that, just everybody has asked, why is he targeting you? Why is he doing this to you? And this really goes back to a long-standing pattern with him, with me, and also with some of his former friends from years ago. He'll emerge into their lives and at first make it sound like he's friendly, and then he goes in for the jugular. But for me, it's always been a matter of power and control. He is my older brother. I think too, it goes into the whole argument of nurture versus nature, nature versus nurture. There is a history of some family members in both my father and mother's side of the family who had schizophrenia and other severe mental health problems. And unfortunately, they hit the genetic jackpot with all my brothers, really, because they all have a history of severe mental health problems, diagnoses and things like that. And I don't. There are plenty of people in my family on both sides who also do not have a history of mental health problems, very productive citizens, very well-liked people. And it's very troubling, very grievous, it's very difficult to deal with. And my mother used to say, and especially toward the end of her life, she said, I knew these things were emerging in them. But I mean, mental health treatment for children, especially back in the 50s and 60s, was just virtually unavailable for the average person.
Right.
So it really goes back to a lifetime of this and the emerging issues that were never really dealt with him.
Can
And
you tell us a little bit about your brother's cult and when he started it and what's his agenda?
yeah, the cult mentality pretty much started with him in the late 70s. But around the year 2000 is when he opened up his first online cult called ETC Ministries. And he basically believes that Jesus gives him dreams and visions of destruction and judgment against his enemies. It's a very hate-oriented group. Um, he'll quote the Bible left and right to try to lure people in and all of this. And so he appeals to that certain segment of religious people who, believe basically that anybody who disagrees with them deserves God's wrath. Um, and one of the other characteristics of any cult leader, just like my brother, is they basically have a God complex. They believe they are God or God's direct mouthpiece. And that is either a delusion and sometimes I think really they know they're not, but they know it's a game. It's a game of superiority. It's a game. And so the idea is to basically suck people for money, claiming that he has all these ministries that he does. I mean, he's basically he's headquartered in his apartment now. He's gone through his second divorce. And yeah, he just, that's what he represents, is basically it's a religion of hate that he slaps God's name onto, to try to lure people into believing he has the authority to do this.
What does ETC stand for?
I think at one point he said something like eternal training something or other of it. It changes.
Yeah.
He morphs around, and that's the kind of the thing. One of the things he does is he sets up multiple identities. Back in the day when they had chat rooms, we got a hold of a chat room administrator, and we said, check the VPNs on all of these people in your chat room. And he found, I don't know, it was about maybe a dozen of them belonged to him. It was the same ISP address. And he was setting up identities, pretending to be women, pretending to be antagonistic to him. And he would argue. He would bring in this collection of his own making of identities, and he would argue with himself. And again, one of the things that cult leaders can do, as he has done, is he believes he's an expert in all things legal and with the court system. When he files his lawsuits, as he did against us 9 times, twice it was to try to exhume our mother after she had passed away and take possession of her body. Just crazy stuff that he was filing these lawsuits without an attorney, cost a few $100s to slam down. And meanwhile, it cost victims thousands of dollars to get a lawyer to dismiss these cases. As I mentioned, I do have judgments and injunctions against him, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit more. But this also speaks to the collapse and kind of corruption of our court system that allows these frivolous and abusive lawsuits to go through. And the cults know this. They know how easy it is to file lawsuits without any basis in reality, make all kinds of slanderous accusations, defamatory accusations against their targets. And again, who wants to be sued? It's a very intimidating process. You can't just get notified of a lawsuit and say, I'll just ignore this, because it results in a default judgment. They can seize your bank accounts, and your wages and everything else. You can't ignore lawsuits. And this is something that we've been reading up on, and with our own experience, it's like, are we the only ones going through this, where somebody who claims that God has told them to do this, are we the only ones going through this? And lo and behold, I found out, no, that is a tactic that cults use. Scientology uses it a lot. They and their lawyers have been reprimanded as being abusive litigants. And my brother has, in fact, also been designated by the court to be an abusive litigant, and he has pre-filing restrictions against him, everything else. But, an older generation of judges would have instantaneously kicked his lawsuits out. why is it the courts are allowing these kinds of cases to clog the court system? And the reason boils down to there is a glut of attorneys. Well, what do you do with a glut of attorneys? You give them jobs as judges, and that you open up the floodgates for basically very mentally unstable people, whether they're in cults or not, to start willy-nilly suing people. There is an expression called stalking through the courts. That's where that comes from, is that usually happens with intimate partners, whether ex-husband, ex-wife, and they will just take their targets to court again and again and again until you get an injunction. But in the meantime, you rack up legal fees.
Right.
Ours were about $200,000 worth of legal fees. And we've read of other people, $500,000 worth of legal fees. And it's like these judges are just not showing the justice that they have a duty to look at these cases and say, no, enough. But cult figures are really tapping.
They don't want to prosecute the cults. On the flip side, they don't want to prosecute the cults. So you've got it. They've got it.
Right.
The court's working for them on both sides, unfortunately, because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because I can tell you that my cult leader actually had charges brought against him for bigamy and child labor laws, and he was in the process of being prosecuted for that. The county decided that they didn't have the money because they got a change of venue, and it got changed to another city. And they said, well, we can't afford as a county to transport all these witnesses 2 hours away and put them up in hotels. And so it's going to break the county. So they dropped the charges. So you've got, there's brokenness on both sides of the ability to not do the lawsuits that should be going through, and then the ability to allow these frivolous ones to take precedence.
Exactly. And it's really on the level of both the criminal and the civil courts, which are just broken. And I'll give you for example, when my brother was going through his second divorce, they worked out a settlement where his wife owned the property, owned the home that was not in his name. It was only solely in his wife's name. So they worked out an agreement where he was going to get a settlement where he would get $90,000 from the sale of her home. Well, our attorneys and I, my husband and I, we jumped right on that. And yes, we did get the $90,000 turned over to the court as partial payment of the judgment that he owes us. But it's in Fulton County, and if you know anything about Fulton County, Georgia, they're about 2 years behind in hearings. And so what is by law supposed to be, a hearing is supposed to be conducted regarding that $90,000 in 30 days. Well, 30 days is long gone and past since I think it was like last November. And so we're just waiting. And our attorney is very frustrated. He said a lot of other attorneys are very frustrated. They cannot get hearings for cases. And that's not just in the civil courts, it's also in the criminal courts. So if you're a victim of a crime, you're having to wait years to even get your first hearing. So
I have another question about your brother. So you say he's operating out of an apartment right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about how big his base of his victims, let's just say, following? Thank you. How many followers he has?
His Facebook thing indicates he has over 200 followers, but as I said, he has a long reputation, and we've actually uncovered fake identities, which are quote unquote following him. So he's following himself. So how many of those are actual people, we don't know. He was also investigated for hacking and other cyber crimes. He has admitted being a hacker. He has boasted online about hacking. And we know for a fact that by his former friends and by other people that he has hacked into people's accounts. And in so doing, he could easily post up what looks like something from them onto his account on Facebook. So we don't really know how many followers he has because of the websites and because of the documented evidence that our lawyers advised us to put up. A lot of people have confronted him, and he has lost followers down through the years. The one thing that a lot of cult leaders have is charm. But that is the one thing that my brother is severely lacking in is seductive charm. And he can pull it off for a little while, but then if anyone disagrees with him, he goes ballistic on them. And,
So
you know, yeah.
So where is he getting his money from? Because some of these big cults, like let's just take Twin Flames for example, they've made millions and millions, and you can see how they've grown over the years because they were living out of hotel rooms, and now they have a couple of houses in Michigan and all this land and Corvettes and Porsches. How is your brother getting money to
Yeah.
not only run this but the legal fees?
Well, he doesn't hire attorneys when he files lawsuits. He has hired attorneys initially. So sometimes, like when he filed bankruptcy, he hired an attorney initially. When there's a potential of an arrest warrant put out on him because of contempt of court issues, he initially hired an attorney. But we have suspected for a long time he does get some level of donations, but we also suspect he's up to no good. And our lawyers have also suspected he's up to no good with other nefarious activities online. For example, and I cannot say this is 100% him, but one of our lawyers did uncover 9 email accounts with the names of kid sex in them. And we can't 100% confirm that they're his. It would take a court subpoena to find out whether those are his. However, the search and the means by which our attorney found these, it's pretty likely those email accounts belong to him. And we also found the names. I don't know what else kid sex would mean.
Okay, I just wanted to
we know that
I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
It's KIDSX, and he's
Okay.
had 9 of them with varying email servers or email companies and things like that. And again, I know I have to tread carefully with this because we don't have 100% conclusive proof of what he's doing with those email accounts, or even if they belong to him. It's likely they do, based on what our attorney told us.
It's a suspicion that is a way that he's earning money or getting some kind of income from that.
Right.
Okay.
He claims himself to be a photographer. Well, what is he taking pictures of to earn money? And
Paulette, okay, this is where I get frustrated with the law enforcement. If there is, let's just say, circumstantial evidence that he may be involved in pedophilia, sexual exploitation of minors, that should be enough right there to get a warrant and seize either his laptop, his desktop, or go after the ISP that's hosting that email. So whatever, if it's Gmail, if it's Hotmail, if it's Yahoo, whoever it is, seize those. I mean, why can't? So in the title of your book, you have the collapse of law and order.
Exactly. We have contacted the FBI. When our attorney told us, he gave us that information about his email addresses or his suspected email addresses. We took that to the FBI. We notified the Fulton County DA's office. They told us there's not enough proof.
Oh, please.
And we hear this all the time. In my book, I outline in depth all of the problems we've had with the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is federal, with the state's attorney's office in Connecticut, with the DA's office there in Georgia. And I mean, even here in Tennessee, and again, we moved to Tennessee because victim advocates said, he's so aggressive, you need to move to a state that will have a better history of enforcing the laws. And so far, we have been able to get the police and to really put the fear of God into him, really, about warning him to stay away. But yeah, this is the problem. I mean, honestly, I get to the point sometimes, you talk about frustration. Believe me, we get to the point sometimes we say we could videotape him doing damage to children or whoever. and the FBI would still not do anything about it. He was breaking federal cyber stalking laws and cyber harassment laws left and right. He was breaking state cyber stalking and cyber harassment laws and just regular stalking and harassment laws. One time I did in Connecticut have an arrest warrant against him for harassment, but they would not extradite him because they consider that a misdemeanor.
Oh,
But
please.
we were told by law enforcement, you want to talk about frustration? There are good law enforcement out there. They're also frustrated because we were told by law enforcement, by police officers, is that we have arrest warrants out that are felonies, and we cannot get cooperation either from the next county over or from another state or from the feds. And these are felonies. These are dangerous felons who are out there, and they can't touch them. And it's extremely frustrating for our law enforcement, our police officers, our U.S. Marshals, who really want to do their job. We were told by police officers, if the judges and the state's attorneys in that case would just do their job, we wouldn't have to keep arresting the same people for worse and worse crimes over and over again.
Right.
This is really a nationwide problem. It happens in red states a lot. It happens in blue states a lot. Our experience here in Tennessee, we've been here about 10 and a half years, is better than we had in Connecticut. We could not get the laws enforced in Connecticut. And we talked with other crime victims. We testified before the legislature trying to get some changes going. And we just couldn't get anything. There's a lot of nepotism in the whole political thing, and in the courts. They are back scratchers. They work hand in hand. And a lot of it is cronyism and nepotism. It's just, it's the worst of the worst. And
I'm writing down questions left and right, and let's just go back to the email for a second. I'm in the IT world, and besides having this podcast and another podcast, and I have I run a couple of websites. I happen to know that if I opened up a Gmail account right now and I tried to so when you open up Gmail, you type in whatever name you want, and if it's available,
yep,
it'll give it to you, or if it's not, it'll say Paulette Buchanan 54321, whatever. But if I wrote kid sex, I think Gmail would flag that and say, see, you're laughing already. And so do you know what email server those are under?
Some of them were Gmail. One was, I think, a couple of them were Yahoo. And I think he hid it because he spelled it KIDSX. But, as soon as the lawyer saw that, and any average person seeing that would, of course, assume,
Right.
It's just missing the E, Yeah. And he's gotten away with that. So, we did, like I said, we contacted the FBI. We contacted Fulton County, where he lived at the time. He's in another county in Georgia now. And we're just told left and right, this is a long-standing pattern, is that even when, for example, he admitted to the FBI that he was committing cyber crimes, the FBI agent, Cyber Crimes Division, told us, well, I warned him to stop. And I said, that's like warning a bank robber to stop robbing banks.
Right.
I mean, it did no good.
What about going to politicians? Have you gone that route at all?
Yep, Democrat, Republican, and we've gotten a lot of support. They're also frustrated, along with the police, that the courts will not do anything. I mean, we heard horror stories from the police themselves. For example, we heard one was a lieutenant of the police department tell us they arrested a guy breaking into a house, caught in the act of burglary. They arrested him. And of course, the arrest warrant ultimately has to be signed off by the state's attorney. This is in Connecticut. And so they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And so they called over to the state's attorney's office, and they said, we're still waiting for you to sign this arrest warrant and, the arrest paperwork and everything. And the state's attorney responded, I'm just not in an arrest warrant signing kind of day. Or mood, I'm not going to do it. Yeah. So, and I'll give you another example of, again, how broken our courts are. Before we left Connecticut, I think it was like a year or two before we left Connecticut, they passed a law in the legislature, bipartisan passing of this law signed by the governor. Anybody who rapes a child 13 years old or younger, automatic 25 years in prison. And my husband and I looked at each other and we said, there's no way any judge is going to do that. And sure enough, just before we left Connecticut, we heard of a case where this guy, the child was 11 years old. He had been sexually assaulting this child for years. And the end result was he did not get the 25 years. So you have what's called, basically legislating from the bench. This judge violated the law. And the only way you can get rid of bad judges is the legislatures have to step up,
Yeah.
and they're going to have to impeach them, because this is ridiculous that these judges can override the legislature. There's no constitutional basis for doing so. They're not operating according to the guidelines of the Constitution. They are, in fact, breaking the law. When a judge says, I don't like this law, I'm going to do whatever I feel like doing, that's a violation of the law. And they're not being held accountable for that. So, this is what we're all really up against.
I have a suspicion that some of the cult-like stuff, I don't think that what happened in Waco with David Koresh and the Branch Davidians shined a very good light on the FBI and was it ATF? I think that was involved in that.
Yeah.
I think
right.
I think that actually kind of scared a lot of the government law enforcement agencies about getting involved, because they do have this mentality that these people are there of their own free will. And they think, well, we can't stop people from doing this on their own free will, so they want to back off and say it's not our responsibility. But I'm with you, and I don't agree with it. But I do think that some of that stuff has made it more difficult for law enforcement, and they're more fearful of getting involved.
Yeah, I mean, the way they went about that was totally wrong. And like the Ruby Ridge thing, it was talk about going overboard. And that's the problem. They don't seem to have good balance. Why would they do that? And yet we have gangs running around like free as a bird, and all different kinds of gangs. You don't see like massive, raids like that on where there are gangs,
Right.
Yeah, we really have an issue of needing to clean house, and just greater accountability. And again, this is where our legislatures and our governors are really falling down. They need, instead of belly aching and complaining about judges, they need to exercise their responsibility before the people. They represent us. They are our representatives. We're paying them to be there. They need to hold impeachment hearings for the most egregious judges who are simply legislating from the bench, not upholding the law, going easy on criminals, not even allowing arrest warrants to be issued. We need to have some serious issues. And again, cults play into this. They know the way the system works. They're not stupid. They know the way the system works in their favor, and they use that to their advantage.
So I like Melody's I think if I'm interpreting her question about Ruby Ridge and Waco, the FBI and ATF, it was a failure, but they were raiding a compound where there was the leader did have an armory, like they had guns, and your brother doesn't have a compound. He doesn't,
Yeah.
Well, all right, so he has an apartment, but I don't think you would need a SWAT team or the entire state, Texas or whatever, of FBI. Like what happened at Ruby Ridge and Waco was, a day's standoff and things like that. I don't see why. I get Melody's question, and I'm trying to say is somebody on a smaller scale, like your brother, who doesn't have a compound. I would imagine your brother might have guns.
He does.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
he's known by the police department. They know he's mentally unstable. We were actually told that by some officers. They said, Unfortunately, we've got hundreds of people like him running around, but they know that he's mentally unstable. And I have some of the police reports, some I've actually posted because they are public record, that indicate that he is not mentally sound. That makes it scary for police officers.
Yeah.
That, they know he's armed. His neighbors who complained about him knew he was armed. He was taking photos of the kids, the neighbor kids. Think about that in conjunction with his email accounts. Uh, it is extremely frustrating because it's a no-brainer. He should be investigated. He should have those computers seized. He should, as having mental health problems, diagnosed. And he's talked about this in his public filings, his lawsuit filings. He has talked about his mental health problems. Of course, he blames me for them. But he shouldn't be, by federal law, allowed to have guns.
Well, that's where that was my very next question. So, all these shootings that have been happening in America over the last 10 years, I'm thinking of the one in Florida and all the school shootings. They're starting to do background checks, I guess, better on people with mental illness. If your brother has already been deemed mentally ill, how is he in possession of guns? And
if the psychiatrists have to report that, and I've been hearing from psychiatrists themselves and reading about it, is that many of them do not want to report someone who's volatile like him out of fear that he will go after them.
Yeah, they're going to be the target.
That is a legitimate concern because they're not protected. And because you can get a gun illegally any way you want to.
Correct.
You have to get it legally.
True.
And so they are concerned about retribution from people like my brother. I'm not saying that's particularly his situation. I don't know. Maybe his psychiatrist doesn't know he has guns. I don't know. Maybe he lied to his psychiatrist, but that's just it. There are so many cracks in the system. And when you talked about background checks, I discussed this in my book. Mental health records are private medical records. You cannot access them to do background checks. If somebody has a mental illness, you cannot find a record on that. That is not a criminal record. It's a mental health record. It's a medical record, and you have no way of accessing those
without a warrant.
Without a warrant. And then how do you get a warrant? Well, you have to present evidence. And and that's just it, is that, again, the police that we've talked to are very frustrated because they said, they've given us examples of things, as I gave you a couple examples, and they cannot get either the district attorneys or the state's attorneys to do what they need to do to enforce the law. So our courts are overwhelmed, for one thing, both on civil levels and criminal levels. And many times the sentences do not fit the crime. People are not put away either at all, or they're not put away, or they're only put away for a short period of time. It's very disturbing. It's very upsetting. And so, citizens like myself, anybody who has dealt with this, with either a domestic violence type situation, which this oftentimes cults do have problems with domestic violence. You have to protect yourself, you have to be vigilant all the time. You have to let your good friends know and your good neighbors know. And we do have support that way. The bottom line of it is, in my situation, I didn't join my brother's cult. I resisted his proselytizing efforts. And for that, I have been paying for decades because he has been on the warpath against me and anybody else that he's tried to lure in. And they have not succeeded in doing that. He goes after them. Anybody who challenges him in the least bit. I really urge people in my kind of situation, and I've met people at these conferences dealing with cults, that you have to be vigilant. You just accept the reality. You're not going to get support from law enforcement, even if you get a written piece of paper such as a protective order or a court judgment or injunctions like we have. That is a piece of paper. It has some weight, But if somebody's really determined to try to ruin your life and incite people to go after you, there's not a lot you can do. That Leah Remini, oh, and I can't remember the guy's name. They did that series on Scientology, and they
Right.
talked about all of the intimidation and harassment tactics that Scientology did against them, that the leader Miscavige that he ordered against them, and little cults do that. When they have these little, and there are so many cults, online cults and actual physical cults, and they're all so deadly. They really get to a point where people have committed suicide, people have committed murder as a result of being in these cults and everything. And so it is a real problem that we have to be very, very careful of. And I basically say, if the government's not going to do anything about it, we have to educate ourselves. Critical thinking, people have to engage in critical thinking, whether it's a religious cult, political cult, self-improvement cult, business cult. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, The Circle, with Tom Hanks and oh, I can't remember her name. But it has to do with total control and all the signs you can recognize to try to get away from somebody who, or just not give time and brain space to people who are out for total control. And thankfully, there are a lot of good resources online that address this issue. What are the characteristics of controlling people? And this is true for personal relationships, whether it's a friend or a romantic type of situation, or whether it's a company, or whether it's a church, or whether it's any other type of religious organization or self-improvement organization. What are the traits of those who are seeking to control you, manipulate you, take advantage of you? Yeah, and I'm glad those resources are out there.
I have a question that might sound silly, or maybe I've been watching too many movies on Netflix or wherever, but they send people in undercover for narcotics. Like, so there's like the cartel. Like, again, I'm watching too many movies, but they will send somebody in undercover to join the cartel for 1 or 2 years to gather evidence against. And so why can't they do that here? Send somebody into your brother's cult. I mean, of course, now I'm saying this out loud, but let's send somebody in undercover, join a cult, and gather evidence from the inside.
Yeah, we asked them to do that many years ago.
Oh, really?
Just do that. I mean, we're strategizing the best way we know how to. And a lot of it has to do with their own agenda of things.
Right.
They told us, it's like, we have all these other big crimes that are happening, to which I wanted to respond, but at the time I was trying to hold back. Yeah, and you're doing a little slam up job with those things too. But, for example, however anybody may feel about the Catholic Church, we know that the directive was given by the FBI, the Justice Department, to go in to Catholic churches and spy on people. And it's like, it's the same thing. I mean, why don't you go after the cartels? Why don't you go after the sex traffickers, the human traffickers? Why don't you devote your time and energy that our tax dollars are paying you to do to go after real threats to society? And that was disturbing, to say the least, that they would like go after an easy target. What are these people doing? I mean, I guess it's so dangerous to go into a church and pray, and it's like, you have people doing human trafficking, doing all kinds of damage. Why don't you go after them? So I think we have a real problem with the corruption needing to be cleaned out. It's very agenda driven, and it needs to be cleaned out. And I don't know who may have the capability to do that. But I still insist that people, regardless of what administration is in there, whether it's Republican or Democrat, you need to be hyper vigilant if you have this kind of thing happening to you. It's just women that I've talked to who have been stalked by ex-partners for a long time. And it's mostly women who are the stalk victims, but not always. There are some women who go around stalking too. But it's an unfortunate thing. You have to live in a very vigilant manner. Interestingly enough, I've read accounts and I've talked to actually people who have come from countries like, in the Middle East, like Lebanon or Iraq. And they talk about, this is just our way of life. We just have to be vigilant. Years ago, I remember somebody from Northern Ireland, they talk about, if they saw a car parked in the street, they immediately would avoid it because they think, oh, it's a car bomb ready to go off. It sounds really weird, but you kind of, it's the only way to keep your sanity is to accept this is the reality of the world we live in. We're not getting the law enforcement that we pay in our taxes that we should be receiving. We have to take care of ourselves. And again, fortunately, your podcast, other people's podcasts, and other people online have talked about what are the warning signs. And it's just too bad that people are, they open themselves
have either
up
one of you watched the Netflix documentary American Nightmare? If you haven't, I suggest watching it because it's the Gone Girl story about the girl who was kidnapped, and the law enforcement doesn't believe her. They think that her and the boyfriend made this whole story up, and it turns out that it was true, and they really were she was kidnapped, and he was drugged, and they left him. It's an unbelievable story, but it goes to what you're saying, that the law enforcement did not do their job in that situation. And well, I shouldn't say that because there was one officer that stood up in another county and finally said, this needs to be looked into. I think there's a connection. I think there's a serial killer out there, and ended up figuring it out. But it's amazing the connection of all of these things.
I'm gonna watch that. On my Netflix, that did come up as how Netflix shows you whatever upcoming. I did see that one. I'm gonna check that out. Paulette, I've never told this story on this podcast or my podcast. A couple of months, like maybe 5 or 6 months after 9/11, and the whole country was still worried, right? And there was some information that terrorists were going to either use a dirty bomb or they were going to get into the war. There was a lot of hyper vigilant or hyper awareness of terrorists. And I was coming home from somewhere, and I was on one of my local expressways, and I was getting off my exit. And when I got off the exit, there were, and I'm not exaggerating, about 10 state trooper cars lined up. And as you get off the exit, they were stopping cars. They were checking seatbelts. And luckily I was wearing mine, so he waved me on, but he rolled the window down. And so long story short is I wrote an editorial to one of my local newspapers and complaining that this is what our tax dollars are going to right after 9/11, that you're checking seatbelts and using all of the state troopers' resources on seatbelts. And I got a visit from the state. Two guys, troopers, came knocking on my door. They wanted to talk to me about my complaint. Nothing ever became of it, but it's just an example of the government is wasting money, I guess, in frivolous things like seatbelt laws or cell phone. I've seen where they stop you. Seriously, when things like this are going on.
For anybody who listens to Andrew's other podcasts, I'm just going to say this was probably Andrew's first version of a weekend rant. His early version of a weekend.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is.
I did it in writing, Melody. So I didn't have a podcast back. This was like 20 years ago.
Yes.
Okay, Paula. So continue. Anything else you want to add to this?
It really boils down to how really do you get through every day. This does have a permanent impact on people. Whether they got into a cult and they realize, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? And they've gotten out, or they're having to fight this kind of aggressive cult thing, because it encompasses, people have their own religious beliefs of whatever type. And, again, these people want to be God in your life. And you have to challenge that, and you have to cope. The whole thing of, why is this happening to me? And, it's so bizarre and so unusual, and not many people go through this kind of thing. I think a lot of it, you have to really focus in on self-care. I know that may sound trite, but it's so true, because this is the kind of thing that's like, it can be like a cancer in your mind. These cultists want to get inside your head, and they want to destroy you from within.
Yeah.
And you have got to stand up to that. You've got to get that and say, I will not despair. I will not give them what they want. They want my destruction, and I will not give it to them. One book in particular that helped me through a lot of stuff was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And, the guy was in a prisoner concentration camp during Nazi Germany times and lost his family, went through a lot. And he noticed, he was a psychologist, psychiatrist, one or the other. And he noted everybody's going through the same thing, but everybody responds differently.
Right.
And we all have choices to make. And we have to choose to say, this is going to make me a better, stronger person. And I don't know why I'm going through it. There are a lot of mysteries in life, but I'm going to try to make the best out of this that I can and help as many people as I can. And so kind of going back full circle, why did I write my book? I'm following what this civil rights attorney said. A lot of people are going through not getting justice in our court system, that there's too much corruption, and we need to fight back about it. We need to educate people about it, because anybody could have something like this happen to them. And so I really try to encourage people to, if you are going through something like this, that stay strong. Do not give these abusers what they want, because they want to destroy you, and you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to be your best friend. You've got to, in a sense, some people don't come from good parenting backgrounds. They don't come from good family support. You have to be, in a sense, your own parent. You have to be your best friend. You've got to take care of yourself. You have value and worth, and you need to take care of yourself.
I think, and Paulette, first of all, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book and the story. I think what needs to be done more of is what Melody and I are trying to do, but we're just a small podcast that just started up, but we need to make more noise, more public awareness, more advocacy. So like Melody runs a Facebook group on Facebook, and you wrote a book. We need, I think, to people to make noise, to the politicians, to the law enforcement, to the media, whether it's real media like television or social media. And then maybe somebody will take notice and start doing something about this. So do you have any organizations or foundations or something that you're involved with that anybody can?
Yeah, International Cultic Association, they are helpful. It's ICSA, International Cultic Studies Association. They are helpful with a lot of resources. There are just so many that can help. But you're absolutely right about speaking out about this. That's one of the messages of my book. We have got to speak out. We've got to let our legislators, it doesn't matter what they are. It doesn't matter what you're registered as. Your legislators are there to represent you. That is their job. And you're paying them to be there. So you've got to contact your legislators. You've got to let them know what you're up against. And yeah, if you can get a community of people to do this, to contact their own legislators in their own states, and work towards some balanced laws that will address these issues. But I do have to say, we're hearing a lot of frustration from our legislators too. Yeah. They can't get the laws enforced either. They can't get the courts to do what's right. And even if you get a really good legislator, they stand alone. They've got to get the whole body on board with this. It is a slow process. We have had good laws passed after many years of people shouting and making their voices heard. but it is a long process. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's what the lawyers told us, and it's what we are doing. My husband and I are making our voices heard on this. And I'm encouraging other people, if you've been through this, you got documentation, court documentation, public records, whatever it is, police reports, those are public records. You have a right to publish them.
Yeah.
Just, consult with a lawyer about the right way to go about it, but get your voices heard out there. The more we educate the public about this, it's like, I think of cultists as cockroaches. They don't like the light shown on them, So, yeah.
I'm going to ask Melody if she has any final thoughts or questions, but I do want to just give a shout out to Netflix and Amazon and HBO, because they are starting to pump out many documentaries on these cults, more than I've seen in the last year than I've seen ever. So I think, and there's a new one out that I just told Melody about on TikTok. There's something about a TikTok cult going on. Yeah, but it's not TikTok doing it. It's somebody manipulating the TikTok videos, whatever. Yeah, using the platform to recruit their victims. So, Melody, any final parting questions or thoughts?
Just to reinforce what Paulette said, yes, basically these networks are helping to shine a light on these cockroaches. I'm going to say that first of all, but absolutely, I agree. The key is speaking out and not being too afraid to speak out. And easily, Paulette, you could be in a situation where you've been so intimidated that you wouldn't speak out, you wouldn't write a book, you wouldn't come on the show. I could be so intimidated by my experience as a cult that I'm not doing a podcast, I'm not doing Facebook support groups and all that stuff. But the fact is that it takes a village, and we need to come together as communities, multiple communities, and say, we aren't going to stand for this. This is unacceptable. Something needs to change. And I love the fact, too, that you also, and I commend you for still having an amount of positivity after your brothers tried to break you down all these years. And, with the lawsuits and just coming at you indefinitely. And you don't know that there's an end to it, but you're still trying to remain positive and see the positive in all of this. And we so appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your story. You've been a tremendous guest, and we really appreciate you coming here.
Well, thank you. And again, I have my days too. And, this is something where it is a very deliberate choice one has to make, especially on dark days when, things just, or just the nightmares come back, Yeah. You have to keep making a very deliberate choice to say, I will not go down that dark road. I will not despair. I am going to fight for justice.
Paulette, would you stay in touch with us on Facebook and let us know if your brother is ever taken down, if they ever finally get him? I know you have this doubt in your mind, but he's bound to make a mistake. A lot of these cult leaders we've noticed over the years, they get brazen. And the one that the Luz del Mundo, the apostles doing 15 years for sexual abuse, they ultimately will get caught if they're brazen and they just think they're immune. So your brother may step in shit one day and not realize it, so please let us know.
Absolutely, and it will be on my websites as well. My websites are Stop Abuse
Let's say if that happens, we'll have you on for a celebratory new episode and an update on your story.
Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, I don't have much faith that he's going to serve much time, but
What's your website again, Paulette?
My website, for my book website, it's fightingforjusticebook.com. And it has a red cover to it because there's another book named Fighting for Justice that is totally different. And my other website is stopabusivelawsuits.com. And I also have a third one, which when it comes due, I'm going to merge it with the Stop Abusive Lawsuits. It's called stopreligiousfrauds.com.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, I'll put all that in the show notes so people can go check it out. And I urge the audience, please speak up, speak out, and let's, like Melody said, it takes a village. So, Paulette, thank you so much for joining us today. It's just an amazing, unfortunate story, but thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you for
so
having me, and
much.
thank you for the work you're doing. This is great. Thank you, and keep it up.
All right.
Okay. Wow, Andrew, what an amazing guest. She was so articulate, such a unique story, packed full of information. I can't thank her enough for coming on.
Absolutely. And I can honestly, this is nothing against our previous guest, but
Right.
first time I didn't squirm in my chair.
Right.
Paulette is a member of one of our groups, and I think she contacted us, or we reached out, and I again, as the audience knows, sometimes we don't have a conversation with our guests, like a pre-conversation. We do before we record. So I didn't know what she had to talk about.
No, I wasn't
I'm making it sound
sure.
horrible.
We knew it. We knew it was going to fit in our wheelhouse. We just weren't exactly sure how.
Right. And wow is yeah. I'm getting to like wow. It was like I'm really happy that we had her on because, and we've even invited her back. She even has some, I one of the things that she brought up, and I don't remember it was before we recorded or during, but she made that connection between cults and human trafficking.
Yes.
And that, there is.
I think that was off mic, but yes.
Yeah. While our podcast is called the Cultimatum, the culture of cults and human trafficking, many times they are intertwined. The cult will traffic its members.
Yes.
Yeah. And Paulette has some background on that as well. So we may have her back to talk about that a little bit. So, but I just a great interview, Melody.
Oh, absolutely. It just touched on all the points and reasons of exactly why we started and why we're wanting to do this podcast. And that's what was so great about it. I mean, not that we don't love to hear people's personal stories, which she had a personal story in there too, but it just took a different turn and really highlighted the reason for this, because the reason isn't just to hear people's tragic stories. It's to hoping to make shine a light and make some change. And that's exactly what she was highlighting. Exactly.
And it's frustrating to listen to somebody who has dirt on, in this case, a member of her family who may be involved with sexual exploitation of children. He has admitted to cyber crimes, and the list goes on, and nobody will touch him. And it just blows my mind. And I'm not pointing the finger at anybody.
Then you add on all the lawsuits he's piled on her and just bombarded her. What was it? 9 lawsuits from her against her and the lawyers involved with trying to help her and her husband. And I think she said he sued judges. I mean, he's just a very extreme person.
And I understand. I think somewhere in there she said they consider him a small fish in the bigger grand scheme of things. Like the government has better things to go after.
Yes.
The cartel, gangs.
That would be great if
when somebody is as blatant as he is.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because sometimes they don't even get that right.
A mind-blowing interview and really just very, very informational. And we 100% have to have her back on for sure. I think that we could delve so much deeper into all the information that she has. She's a resource. She's a resource for us is what it is.
Yeah.
For sure.
And all of the websites and everything she mentioned, we'll put all that in the show notes. So great episode, Melody.
Excellent. Thank you for tuning in to Cultimatum. Your support is greatly appreciated. Please take a moment to rate our podcast on platforms such as Apple and Spotify. And don't forget to follow, share, and keep listening to our latest episodes.
And join our growing community by connecting with us on Facebook under the group name Cultimatum. If you have a cult or human trafficking experience you'd like to share, feel free to reach out to us via email at cultimatumpodcast@gmail.com.
For additional support and resources for ex-cult members, consider joining the Facebook group Cult Escape and Recovery.
And if you're interested in more content from me, check out my other podcast, Anonymous Andrew, life and the choices we make. And thank you for being part of our journey. And we'll talk to you next week, Melody.
Yes, bye-bye.